Forbidden love between a 70-year-old woman and a young man. The hidden truth. True stories. Can a connection be so intense that it could be mistaken for a crime? What if America's greatest literary secret was about to be revealed by its most unlikely admirer? This is the story of Evelyn Reed, an American legend. At age 30, her first and only novel, The Glass Prism, exploded onto the literary scene, dissecting the American soul with brutal beauty. The book won worldwide acclaim, was translated into dozens of languages, and became required reading at every university. And then at the height of her fame, Evelyn did the unthinkable. She disappeared. For 50 years the world debated. Was she dead? Mad from the pressure? Far from the literary circles of New York on a sweltering UCLA campus, Liam Walker, a 22-year-old master's student, refused to accept silence. For him, The Glass Prism was a map to his own soul. He spent months in an academic obsession, combing through archives, property records, and old interviews, following a trail that led him to a secluded house in Big Sur, California. There, under an assumed name, lived an 88-year-old woman the world knew as Evelyn Reed. Liam's first attempt was an absolute disaster. He knocked on the faded blue door, the sound echoing against the roar of the Pacific. The woman who answered was small, fragile as antique glass, but her eyes held a ferocity untouched by time. He stammered, mentioning her name, the book. The door slammed in his face with a violence that left him stunned. But Liam was as stubborn as she was reclusive. He spent the night in his battered pickup truck, listening to the Big Sur wind, and the next day, he didn't knock. He simply left a manila envelope on the doorstep. Inside was not a fan request, but a brilliant and original 10-page analysis dissecting the symbolism of the glass prism in the final chapter of his work. On the third day, as he approached, the door opened before he could knock. Evelyn stared at him. "What did you mean?" she asked, her voice rough with disuse. "By fragmentation as an act of release, not loss." It was the beginning of a conversation that would last months. Evelyn's home was a sanctuary, a reflection of her mind. Complex, brilliant, and completely isolated from the outside world. The walls were lined floor to ceiling, not only with literature, but also with quantum physics, medieval history, and botany. Their bond wasn't romance, it was a resonance of intellectual souls. Liam became her only student and at the same time her teacher. He reconnected her to the world she had abandoned, bringing her the works of new philosophers and poets. In return, she offered him the most precious treasure, her time and her wisdom, sharpening his mind with relentless precision. But the small, isolated community of Big Sur saw something very, very different. They didn't see the exchange of ideas. They saw appearances, and appearances were damning. They saw a handsome young man, 22 years old, full of vitality, parking his battered pickup truck in front of the 88-year-old recluse's house at increasingly irregular times. What could be going on inside? The gossip, first a whisper on the wind, turned into a roar. The catalyst occurred on a hot July afternoon. Evelyn's garden, wild and neglected for decades, was a jungle of weeds. Liam, seeing her struggle to simply reach the mailbox, offered to clear the path. The air was heavy and humid. After an hour of manual labor under the California sun, he took off his shirt. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, a frail figure behind the dusty glass. She didn't see a young body. She saw energy, the raw life she had kept hidden for 50 years. But the delivery driver, carrying a rare package of books Liam had ordered for her, saw something very different. He saw the reclusive old woman standing there, watching a shirtless, sweaty, muscular young man working on her property. The scene, to him, was unmistakable. He took this image to the only grocery store in the area, the nerve center of coastal social life. And there, that image became a story. The storekeeper, a pragmatic man who understood balance sheets, not books, delivered the final verdict as he bagged groceries. "It's obvious what he wants. He's after her money." Another customer added, "He wants the copyright to that famous book. When she dies, he'll live like a king." The narrative was complete. The senile, lonely old woman, desperate for any scrap of attention, and the unscrupulous young profiteer, using his charm to secure his fortune. They became the coast's main spectacle. Every book delivery, every time Liam was seen buying groceries for her, every laugh the mailman heard coming from inside the house. All were filtered through this sordid lens. The community judged them, dissecting their lives, never able to begin to comprehend the sublime nature of the bond that was being forged behind that faded blue door. 6 months passed. 6 months of debate, reading, and a mutual trust that solidified like the granite rocks beneath the house. The Big Sur community had settled into its sordid narrative. Liam was the predator, Evelyn the prey. Their judgment was absolute, but ultimately, completely irrelevant. Because behind that faded blue door, the intellectual marathon continued, fierce and relentless. Evelyn, who had spent half a century building impenetrable walls around herself, felt she had finally found someone. Not a fan, not a student, but an equal. Someone she could trust not only with her thoughts but with her deepest secret. The turning point came not on a bright Californian day, but on a moody autumn afternoon, when the Big Sur fog engulfed the coast, turning the outside world into a gray, damp blur. The wind howled, a low wail that rattled the window panes. They had been sitting in silence for almost an hour, surrounded by stacks of books, the sound of the waves crashing below providing the only soundtrack. Suddenly, Evelyn, who rarely moved without deliberation, rose from her worn armchair. Her eyes, usually sharp and analytical while debating, now seemed focused inward, on something distant. "Come," she said simply. The silent command carried more weight than any shout. "You must see." Liam followed her, confused. She didn't lead him to the living room or the kitchen. She led him down a narrow, dark hallway at the back of the house, a place he had barely noticed before, one that seemed to lead nowhere. She stopped before a solid, unadorned oak door, a door he had never seen open. It seemed like just another part of the wall. She reached under the collar of her thick sweater and pulled out a leather cord. Dangling from it was a single bronze key, worn by time and contact with her skin. He had never seen it before. She kept it hidden, close to her heart. She inserted it into the lock. The only sound in the silent hallway, other than the wind outside, was the metallic click of a locking mechanism that had not been used in a long time. A dry, rusty sound that echoed with finality. The door opened with a low groan. The air that escaped the room was different. It wasn't the smell of mold or forgotten things. It was the smell of aged paper, of dried ink, of decades of concentrated thought and deliberate solitude. The room that revealed itself wasn't a bedroom, as the warehouse gossips might have imagined in their most sordid fantasies. It wasn't a storage room. It was a sanctuary, an office perfectly preserved, frozen in time. The walls, as in the main room, were lined with shelves, but these didn't contain other authors' books. They contained hundreds, perhaps thousands, of identical black hardcover notebooks. Each was meticulously labeled on the spine in precise, elegant handwriting: 1976, 1985, 1994, 2001, 2020. It was an entire library of a single mind. And in the center of the room, dominating the space, was a massive wooden table. Above it, there was no dust, only work. A mountain of paper, thousands upon thousands of handwritten pages, covered in that same handwriting. Waiting. Liam stood there, breathless. The smell of aged paper and dried ink was overpowering, almost thick enough to chew. He wasn't just in a room. He was at the epicenter of a 50-year-old secret, the ground zero of modern American literature. Evelyn watched him, her eyes measuring his reaction, his silence. "The world thinks my voice fell silent in 1975, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper in the still air of that sanctuary. "They were wrong. A writer doesn't stop writing, just as he doesn't stop breathing. I simply stopped publishing." She approached the table, her wrinkled hand hovering over the mountain of pages with a reverence that seemed mingled with terror. "This," she said, her voice unwavering, "is the heart of the prism, the answer to the first book, my life's work." It was a monumental novel, an architecture of thought she had been building in secret, brick by brick, for 5 decades. A book she considered too vast, too complex, and too painfully personal for the world that had turned her into a myth, and then discarded her as a madwoman. "But now I'm old, Liam." She finally turned to him, and for the first time since he'd met her, the steely fierceness in her eyes was replaced by a transparent vulnerability, an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. My hands are shaking, she confessed, holding up her trembling right hand as proof. My eyes are tired, too tired to read my own footnotes. My mind is still there, sharp as ever, but my body is a sinking ship, and the load is too heavy. She looked back at the stack of paper, at what she called the monster. This work is an ocean, she said, and I no longer have the strength to cross it alone. I don't need a fan, I need a captain. I need a cartographer, someone who can read the maps I've drawn in the dark all these years. The look she gave him wasn't that of a teacher to a student, nor of an elderly woman to a young man, a dynamic the outside world was so eager to sexualize. It was the look of a master craftsman seeking the only apprentice capable of inheriting the secret of his craft before it was too late. The offer was made. In that instant, the scandal consuming the small, petty community outside seemed pathetic, irrelevant, like the buzzing of a mosquito amidst a symphony. The sordid narrative of sensuality and exploitation evaporated, replaced by a much more stunning and, frankly, much more intimate truth. Their true affair wasn't about physical touch. It was about legacy. It was the opportunity to participate in the creation, the resurrection, of the most anticipated literary work of the century. The following year was a descent into a kind of feverish, monastic work. The small house in Big Sur, once a fortress of seclusion, became an intense literary workshop, vibrating with an energy no one outside could comprehend. The community outside continued to whisper, seeing the lights on at 2 a.m. as proof of their sordid fantasies, unaware that the energy within was purely intellectual, the passion of two minds engaged in a creative battle. They worked 18 hours a day. The process was a brutal and beautiful fusion. Liam read the chapters aloud, his young voice giving sound to the words Evelyn had only heard in her own head for decades. She would interrupt him abruptly. "No, that word is wrong. The weight is wrong. The texture is wrong. Find another." And they would debate a single sentence for an hour. He took on the role of cartographer. He dove into the 500 black notebooks, tracing timelines, connecting themes she had begun in 1980, and resolved with a footnote in 2010. He became the archivist of her soul. He typed the thousands of handwritten pages, organizing what seemed like a chaos of fragments, alternate versions, and notes into a cohesive, breathable structure. And they argued. They fought, not like a young man and an old woman, but like two architects over the design of a cathedral. "You're softening too much," she would scream, pounding the table. "You're hiding behind complexity. Be clear," he would retort, pushing the pages back at her. It was the first time in 50 years that anyone had challenged Evelyn Reed on her own turf, and she reveled in it. He wasn't a fawning fan. He was an indispensable collaborator. It was the fusion of two minds, separated by 66 years of life, but united by a single, relentless goal: to give final form to the monster. A year later, the manuscript was ready. Its arrival at a major New York record label was a shock. The news leaked out. Evelyn Reed was alive, and she had a new book. The publication was a worldwide event. The book not only met expectations, it exceeded them, universally acclaimed as the undisputed masterpiece of a generation. But the biggest surprise, the revelation that silenced the tabloids and the small town's slanderous critics, wasn't in the novel's pages. It was on the first page. The dedication. In simple letters, it read, "For Liam, the stubborn student who encountered an old ghost and became the midwife of his soul. This work is as much his as it is mine." In a single, rare written interview, Evelyn clarified the truth. Liam was not her lover, but her intellectual heir, her indispensable collaborator. The scandal the world so enthusiastically imagined was actually one of the most profound and moving stories of creative partnership. Liam, the alleged profiteer, was actually a catalyst for genius, and Evelyn, the alleged victim, was a master who found her most brilliant disciple in the final act of her life. Their true story surprised everyone, revealing that the strongest bonds are often those of the mind.